There was a time when standing by your word meant something, when commitment was not just a promise made at the altar, but a daily choice to honor the person you vowed to love. What happened on Family Feud in September 2024 reminded everyone why truth matters more than pride. When a wife's simple answer exposed years of deception, even Steve Harvey had to stop the cameras. What unfolded next proved that some secrets are too heavy to carry, and sometimes the moment of truth arrives exactly when it needs to, no matter how inconvenient the timing. Before we begin this extraordinary story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these powerful Family Feud moments that go beyond the game. Robert and Michelle Thompson appeared to be the embodiment of success. Robert, at 56 years old, owned a thriving construction company in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was the kind of man people described as a self-made success story. He had started with nothing, worked his way up from being a day laborer to owning one of the most respected construction firms in the Southeast. He drove a luxury truck, wore expensive watches, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had conquered every challenge life had thrown at him. Michelle, at 54, was a high school English teacher beloved by her students and respected by her colleagues. She had devoted her entire adult life to education, believing deeply in the power of learning to transform lives. She and Robert had been married for 32 years, having met when they were both 22 years old. Michelle had supported Robert through every stage of building his business, often working 2 jobs herself in the early years to keep their household afloat while Robert invested everything into his company. The Thompsons had 3 grown children, all successful in their own right. Their oldest son was a doctor, their daughter was a lawyer, and their youngest was finishing graduate school. From every external measure, Robert and Michelle had achieved the American dream. They had built something substantial together, raised good children, contributed to their community. But beneath the surface of this success story, fault lines had been forming for years. What made their Family Feud appearance particularly meaningful to Michelle was that it represented something she had been requesting for years: quality time together as a family. Robert was always working, always on a job site, always taking calls about projects and problems. Even on vacations, he was mentally absent, preoccupied with business. Michelle had learned to accept this as the price of his success, telling herself that his dedication to work was what had given their family such a comfortable life. But Michelle carried a secret pain that she had never shared with anyone, not even her closest friends. For the past 5 years, Robert had been emotionally distant from her in ways that went beyond being busy with work. He rarely touched her anymore except in the most perfunctory ways. Their intimate life had dwindled to almost nothing. When she tried to talk about it, he would deflect, blame, stress, promise things would get better after the next big project. Michelle had begun to feel invisible in her own marriage, like a housekeeper and event coordinator rather than a wife. What Michelle did not know, what she had refused to let herself suspect despite the signs, was that Robert had been living a double life. For 7 years, he had maintained a second family. A woman he had met through his business, a project manager named Sandra, had been his partner in every way that mattered. They had 2 children together, ages 6 and 4. Robert had bought them a house in another part of Charlotte, supported them financially, attended school events for those children, played the role of father and partner in a completely separate life. The construction business had provided perfect cover. Robert was always on job sites, always traveling to check on projects, always had legitimate reasons to be away. He had become extraordinarily skilled at compartmentalizing, at keeping his 2 worlds completely separate. He had convinced himself that he was not really hurting anyone. Michelle had her teaching career and their grown children. Sandra had his emotional presence and his time. He was providing for both families financially. In his twisted logic, he was being responsible, taking care of his obligations to both families. The Family Feud appearance had been Michelle's idea, something she had pushed for as a way to bring the family together. Robert had initially resisted, uncomfortable with the exposure, but Michelle had been so excited about it that he had eventually agreed. He saw it as relatively low risk. They would answer some questions, maybe win some money, and Michelle would have her family memory. He had no reason to think that a simple game show could threaten the elaborate structure of lies he had maintained for 7 years. Steve Harvey welcomed the Thompson family onto the Family Feud stage with his usual enthusiasm. The family seemed pleasant and well coordinated, winning the first several rounds with solid answers and good teamwork. Robert was particularly competitive, clearly someone who was used to winning and uncomfortable with any other outcome. Michelle was supportive and encouraging, cheering for every family member, genuinely enjoying the experience of having everyone together. The turning point came in the third round. The Thompson family was competing against the Martinez family from Miami, and the game was close. Steve read the question from his card with perfect comedic timing. We asked 100 married people to complete this sentence. The biggest lie I ever told my spouse was blank. The question was designed to be funny, to generate amusing answers about hidden purchases or white lies about cooking. It was meant to be harmless game show fare. Michelle was the first from her family to answer. She stepped to the podium with a smile, clearly enjoying herself. Steve repeated the question, and Michelle considered for a moment. Then she leaned into the microphone and said something that would change everything. I'm working late, but really I'm somewhere else. The answer came from deep in her subconscious, from years of hearing Robert use that exact excuse, from the suspicions she had never fully acknowledged even to herself. The audience laughed and applauded. It was a relatable answer, the kind that married people everywhere could understand. Steve nodded appreciatively. Good answer, good answer. The board revealed it was the #1 response, worth 38 points. The Thompson family celebrated, and Michelle beamed, proud of her contribution to their score. But if anyone had been watching Robert carefully, they would have seen the color drain from his face. Because that was his lie, that exact lie. For 7 years, he had been telling Michelle he was working late, checking on job sites, meeting with clients, and he had been somewhere else entirely, with Sandra and their children, at soccer games and parent-teacher conferences, at dinner tables and bedtime story sessions, living a complete life that Michelle knew nothing about. Casual way Michelle had given that answer, the way the audience had laughed at its universal relatability, made Robert realize something terrifying. Everyone knew. Maybe not his specific situation, but everyone understood that this lie was common, recognizable, almost cliché in its predictability. The game continued, but Robert was no longer fully present. His responses became more mechanical, less confident. Their son noticed and whispered to his sister that something was wrong with Dad. Michelle, still riding the high of her #1 answer, did not notice her husband's deteriorating state. She was too busy enjoying the moment, savoring this rare time when the whole family was together and engaged in something fun. Then came the question that would shatter everything. Steve Harvey, always working to keep the energy high and the content entertaining, asked the next question with his characteristic flair. We asked 100 people to name something you would be shocked to discover your spouse has been hiding from you. The Martinez family went first, giving answers like a secret bank account and a gambling problem. Both were on the board. Control came back to the Thompsons. Michelle was up again. She approached the podium, still energized from her previous success. Steve repeated the question, and Michelle thought about it seriously. What would truly shock her if Robert had been hiding it? She considered the question from multiple angles, thinking about what would represent the ultimate betrayal of trust in a marriage. Then she gave her answer, speaking clearly into the microphone. Another family, like a whole other wife and kids. The audience reacted with a mix of gasps and nervous laughter. It was such an extreme answer, almost absurdly dramatic. Surely that was not something that happened in real life, or at least not often enough to be on a Family Feud survey. Steve Harvey raised his eyebrows, playing up the dramatic nature of the answer. Another family? Like a whole situation. Michelle laughed, slightly embarrassed by how dramatic her answer sounded when said out loud. I know it sounds crazy, but you asked what would be shocking. Steve turned to the board with theatrical flair. Well, let us see if this shocking answer is up there. Another family, whole other wife and kids. Survey says. The board revealed it. #2 answer, 23 points. The audience erupted in surprise and amusement. Michelle laughed and did a little celebration dance, thrilled that her dramatic answer had been correct. Her family members high-fived her, congratulating her on another great response. But Robert did not celebrate. Instead, he stood completely still, his face ashen, staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, or perhaps seeing himself reflected in her innocent, unknowing eyes and finally recognizing the monster he had become. The weight of 7 years of deception crashed down on him in that moment. The careful compartmentalization he had maintained, the ability to move between his two lives without apparent conscience, suddenly shattered completely. Michelle turned to share her excitement with Robert and stopped mid-smile. The look on his face was not right. It was not nervousness or concentration. It was devastation. It was guilt made visible. It was the face of a man watching his entire world collapse. Honey, are you okay? Michelle asked, her own smile fading as concern replaced celebration. Robert opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Michelle, at their children, at Steve Harvey, at the hundreds of people in the audience, and the walls he had built around his secret life crumbled. Without saying a word, Robert turned and walked off the stage. Just walked away mid-game, mid-celebration, leaving his entire family standing there in confused shock. The audience fell silent, unsure if this was part of the show or something real. Steve Harvey's expression shifted from entertainer to genuine concern. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the moment when entertainment became something much more serious. Michelle stood frozen at the podium, her mind trying to process what had just happened. Why would Robert walk off like that? It was just a game, just silly questions. But even as she tried to rationalize it, something in her heart knew. The way he had looked at her, the devastation on his face, the fact that he could not even speak. Michelle's daughter reached for her mother's hand, and in that simple gesture of support, Michelle felt her carefully constructed denial begin to crack. Steve Harvey made an immediate decision. Cut the cameras, stop recording. This is not entertainment. Something real is happening here, and this family needs privacy and support, not an audience. The production crew scrambled to comply, though they exchanged uncertain glances. This was unprecedented. Steve Harvey, the consummate professional who had hosted thousands of episodes without missing a beat, was stopping production mid-game. Steve approached Michelle gently, his voice low and kind. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. When you gave that answer about another family, was that just a random guess, or was there something behind it?" Michelle looked at Steve, and in his eyes she saw compassion, not judgment. The question opened a door she had kept locked for years. "I do not know," she said quietly. "I have had suspicions, things that did not add up. Times when Robert said he was one place, but I found evidence he was somewhere else. But I did not want to believe it." Steve nodded, his years of life experience evident in his response. "Sometimes we know things without letting ourselves know them. Your answer was not random. Somewhere inside you knew, and Robert's reaction just confirmed it. Michelle's knees weakened, and her children immediately surrounded her, supporting her physically and emotionally. Steve continued, "We need to find Robert and talk to him. This needs to be addressed now, not later. Secrets this big do not just go away." Production assistants found Robert in a hallway outside the studio, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, head in his hands. When Steve and Michelle approached with their children, Robert looked up, and the guilt and shame on his face told Michelle everything she needed to know. She did not need him to say the words. She could see the truth written in every line of his face, in the defeated slope of his shoulders, in the way he could not meet her eyes. "How long?" Michelle's voice was steady, but Steve could see her hands shaking. Robert's response came out as barely a whisper. 7 years. The number hung in the air like an accusation. 7 years of lies, 7 years of double life. 7 years of Michelle sleeping beside a stranger who wore her husband's face. Their daughter gasped audibly. Their sons stood rigid, processing the magnitude of their father's betrayal. "Do I know her?" Michelle asked, each word deliberate and controlled. Robert nodded miserably. "Sandra, from work, project manager on the Riverside development." Michelle remembered Sandra. She had met her at company events, had made polite conversation with her at holiday parties. She tried to recall if there had been signs, meaningful glances, awkward moments, but there had been nothing. Robert and Sandra had been perfectly professional in Michelle's presence. The deception had been complete. "Children," Michelle's voice broke on the word. Robert nodded again. "Two. A boy and a girl, 6 and 4 years old." The information hit Michelle like physical blows, not just an affair. Not just 7 years of lying, but children, whole human beings Robert had created and was raising while pretending to be fully committed to the family he had with Michelle. The betrayal was so complete, so comprehensive, that it seemed almost unreal. Steve Harvey had seen many things in his career, but this level of deception shocked even him. "Brother," he said to Robert, his voice conveying both disappointment and something like pity, "you have been living 2 complete lives." Robert's response was barely audible. "Yes," Steve shook his head slowly. "Man, that is not just a mistake or a moment of weakness. That is a choice you made every single day for 7 years, every time you went to that other house, every time you played with those children, every time you lied to this woman who trusted you completely. That was a choice." Michelle's oldest son, Michael, the doctor, spoke up then. His voice was shaking with rage. "Do those children know about us? Are we the secret, or are they?" Robert's answer was perhaps the cruelest revelation yet. "They know about you." Sandra's children knew that their father had another family, an original family that he visited but did not live with full time. In the other household, Robert had positioned himself as a dedicated father who worked hard to support both his children and his elderly parents. The children there thought he was a hero, sacrificing time with them to take care of family obligations. Michelle processed this information with a clarity that surprised even herself. "So for 7 years, I have been the obstacle. In your other life, I am the reason you cannot be there all the time. I am the old obligation you have to manage while building your real life with Sandra and your other children." Robert could not deny it. The truth was undeniable now, laid bare in a studio hallway with his entire family bearing witness to his comprehensive betrayal. Steve Harvey made a decision that reflected both his wisdom and his compassion. This family needed privacy, professional help, and time to process what had been revealed. He arranged for the Thompsons to be taken to a private room and personally called a crisis counselor he knew to come to the studio immediately. He also instructed the production team that nothing from this episode would air without the family's explicit consent. This was bigger than television. This was a family in crisis, and they deserved to work through it away from cameras and audiences. In the private room with the counselor present, the full story emerged. Robert explained how the double life had started. An affair that he had intended to end had resulted in Sandra becoming pregnant. When she told him, he had been faced with a choice: abandon the child and Sandra or accept responsibility. He had chosen to accept responsibility, but in the most cowardly way possible. Instead of being honest with Michelle and facing the consequences, he had simply added Sandra and their child to his life while maintaining his marriage as if nothing had changed. When Sandra had become pregnant again, Robert had already been living the double life for 2 years. It had become his normal. He had convinced himself he was handling it, that he was being responsible to both families. The construction business provided enough income to support both households comfortably. His frequent absences from both homes seemed justified by the demands of running a successful company. He had become so practiced at the deception that it felt almost natural to him. Michelle's questions were precise and devastating. Did you love her? Do you love her? Does she know about this Family Feud appearance? Or is she at home right now wondering why you are not there for dinner with her and your children? Each question stripped away another layer of Robert's rationalizations, forcing him to confront the full scope of his choices. Yes, he loved Sandra. No, she did not know he was at Family Feud. She thought he was at a multi-day project site inspection in another state. The counselor guided the conversation, helping the family process the immediate crisis while recognizing that the real work would take months or years. She helped Michelle understand that she did not need to make any decisions right now about her marriage. She helped the children express their feelings without it devolving into a shouting match. And she helped Robert begin to understand the magnitude of what he had done and what genuine accountability would require. After 3 hours of intense conversation, Michelle made her first decision. She needed Robert to leave their home immediately. She needed space to think without his presence confusing her emotions. Robert agreed without argument, recognizing he had forfeited any right to make demands. Their children would stay with Michelle, providing support and allowing her to decide how much contact with Robert she wanted and when. What happened in the days and weeks that followed was a testament to the power of truth, no matter how devastating. Michelle, with the support of her children and close friends, began the process of untangling her life from Robert's. She consulted with attorneys about her legal options. She learned that she was entitled to far more than she had realized, both in terms of assets and in terms of child support for the children Robert had hidden from her. The construction business, built during their marriage with her support, was partially hers regardless of Robert's double life. But the legal aspects, while important, were not what consumed Michelle's thoughts. She was grappling with deeper questions about identity and reality. For 32 years, she had believed she was in a marriage. Now she understood that for at least the last 7 years, she had been in something else entirely. An arrangement, a convenient fiction, but not a marriage, because marriages required honesty and mutual commitment, neither of which had existed in her relationship with Robert. Robert, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his choices from multiple directions. Sandra, upon learning that Robert had been exposed, demanded answers about his intentions. Did he plan to leave Michelle and commit fully to her and their children? Or had she and their children been the secret all along, the shameful second family he would never publicly acknowledge? Robert's inability to give her a clear answer told Sandra everything she needed to know. She filed for child support and made it clear that while she wanted him involved in their children's lives, she had no interest in waiting for him to decide which family he truly wanted. Michelle's decision came 6 months after the Family Feud revelation. She filed for divorce, not out of anger or revenge, but from a clear-eyed recognition that the marriage she thought she had never actually existed, and she was not interested in building a new marriage with someone who had demonstrated such capacity for sustained deception. The divorce was complicated, involving division of substantial assets and sorting through years of financial entanglement. But Michelle approached it with the same methodical care she brought to her teaching, ensuring she protected her interests while avoiding unnecessary cruelty. Steve Harvey stayed in contact with Michelle throughout this period, not for television purposes, but because he felt a genuine responsibility to support her through the aftermath of what had been revealed on his show. He connected her with resources, recommended therapists who specialized in helping people rebuild after betrayal, and simply called periodically to check in. His support meant more to Michelle than he probably realized. In her moments of doubt and pain, knowing that someone outside her immediate circle cared about her well-being helped her feel less alone. 1 year after the revelation, Michelle made a decision to speak publicly about her experience. She gave an interview to a national magazine, not seeking sympathy or attention, but wanting to help other women who might be in similar situations without realizing it. Her interview was remarkable for its honesty and lack of bitterness. She talked about the signs she had missed or chosen to ignore, the emotional distance that she had attributed to stress. The times Robert's stories did not quite add up, but she had given him the benefit of the doubt. The gut feeling she had dismissed as paranoia or insecurity. "I want women to know that trusting your instincts is not the same as being paranoid," Michelle said in the interview. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. That does not mean you should live in constant suspicion, but it does mean you should not dismiss your own perceptions to keep the peace or avoid uncomfortable conversations. I dismissed my instincts for years because I did not want to be that wife, the suspicious one, the untrusting one. But it turns out my instincts were trying to protect me from a truth I was not ready to face." The interview resonated powerfully with women across the country. Michelle received thousands of letters and messages from women who had dismissed their own suspicions, who had prioritized maintaining the appearance of a happy marriage over addressing underlying problems. Many women credited her interview with giving them the courage to ask difficult questions in their own relationships. Some discovered affairs. Others discovered different forms of deception or disrespect. But all of them appreciated Michelle's reminder that their perceptions and feelings mattered. Robert's journey was different and more difficult. He lost his business, not through legal consequences, but through professional ones. Word of the double life spread through the construction community, and clients began terminating contracts. Subcontractors who had worked with him for years refused future jobs. His reputation, built over decades of professional excellence, was destroyed by the revelation of his personal choices. He was forced to sell the company and faced significant financial consequences from supporting 2 households through the divorce proceedings. But the financial and professional losses were nothing compared to the personal ones. His relationship with his adult children from his marriage to Michelle was severely damaged. They struggled to reconcile the father they had known and admired with the man who had betrayed their mother so comprehensively. Family gatherings became strained and eventually stopped altogether. Robert found himself largely alone, separated from both families, trusted fully by neither. 2 years after the Family Feud revelation, Steve Harvey invited Michelle to appear on his talk show. The segment was titled "Living Your Truth After Betrayal," and it became one of the most watched episodes of the season. Michelle spoke with eloquence and hard-won wisdom about her journey from that shocking moment on Family Feud to where she was now. She talked about the grief of losing not just a marriage, but the story she had told herself about her life. About discovering that the past 32 years meant something different than she had believed. But Michelle also talked about the unexpected gifts that had come from the destruction of her old life. She had discovered her own strength and resilience. She had deepened her relationships with her children, who now saw her as a complete person rather than just their mother. She had pursued interests and dreams she had set aside during her marriage. She had started writing, processing her experience through essays that had been published in various magazines and websites. She had become an advocate for women going through divorce, particularly older women who had devoted decades to marriages that turned out to be based on lies. "I am not grateful for what Robert did," Michelle told Steve during the interview, "but I am grateful for who I have become because of it. I was living a half-life, accepting crumbs of attention and affection, telling myself it was enough because I did not want to seem demanding or ungrateful. Now I know what I deserve, and I will never settle for less than that again." The audience's response was overwhelming. Standing ovation that lasted several minutes, women crying and nodding in recognition of their own experiences, people calling out words of support and encouragement. Steve's commentary during this segment reflected his own evolution from the experience. "When Robert walked off that stage, I knew something significant had happened, but I did not fully understand the depth of it until later. This man had built an entire parallel existence. When Michelle's answer exposed it, he could not handle the weight of his lies anymore. Walking away was not strength, it was collapse. But in that collapse, the truth finally had space to emerge." 3 years after the revelation, Michelle had built a completely new life. She had sold the house she had shared with Robert. unable to live in a space so filled with memories that now felt tainted. She bought a smaller home that was entirely hers, decorated to her taste, filled with her energy. She had advanced in her teaching career, taking on leadership roles she had previously declined because they would require time and energy she had reserved for managing Robert's moods and needs. She traveled, pursued hobbies, developed friendships that were deep and genuine. Her relationship with her children had evolved into something richer than before. They saw her now as a full person, not just a mother, and they respected the strength and grace with which she had handled an impossible situation. They had also had to reckon with their own feelings about their father. Anger, disappointment, grief for the man they thought he was, uncertainty about whether and how to maintain a relationship with him. The counselor who worked with the family helped them understand that they could love their father while also holding him accountable, that maintaining boundaries was healthy, not cruel. Robert's story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of deception and the impossibility of maintaining lies indefinitely. He had lost both families in different ways. Michelle had divorced him and moved on. Sandra had ended their relationship, unwilling to be with someone she could no longer trust. His children from both families struggled to respect him. He faced financial ruin from supporting two households through divorce proceedings and child support obligations. The life he had tried to build on lies had collapsed completely, leaving him with wreckage from multiple directions. But Robert eventually began the difficult work of accountability and change. He started attending therapy to understand the patterns that had led him to make such destructive choices. He worked to rebuild relationships with all his children, accepting that they might never fully trust him again, but committed to being as present and honest as they would allow. He took a job working for someone else, leaving behind the status and control of owning his own company, recognizing that he needed structure and accountability that self-employment had not provided. 5 years after the Family Feud revelation, a documentary was produced about the Thompson family story and its broader implications. The documentary examined how one moment on a game show had exposed a deception and set in motion events that touched dozens of lives. It followed Michelle's journey to independence and self-discovery. It documented Robert's attempts at redemption and accountability. It showed the children's struggles to understand and process their father's actions. And it explored the ripple effects on Sandra and her children, the hidden family suddenly exposed. The documentary did not offer simple answers or easy redemption. It showed that some betrayals were too comprehensive for reconciliation, that some trust once broken could not be rebuilt, and that consequences for destructive choices could be severe and long-lasting. But it also showed that individuals could survive devastating revelations and rebuild their lives in ways that honored their true selves rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. Steve Harvey's involvement in the documentary reflected his ongoing connection to the story. He spoke about how that moment when Robert walked off stage had changed his approach to hosting Family Feud. "I used to think my job was to keep things light, keep things moving, keep people entertained. Now I understand that sometimes my job is to recognize when something real is happening and create space for that reality, even if it means stopping the show." That day taught me that human dignity and family well-being matter more than any television program. The documentary examined the broader cultural implications of the Thompson family story. Marriage counselors discussed how common secret second families were, how technology and modern work patterns made sustained deception easier than in previous generations. They talked about warning signs that partners might recognize if they trusted their instincts rather than dismissing them. They emphasized that betrayal of this magnitude was not the fault of the betrayed spouse, that no amount of being a better partner would have prevented someone determined to deceive from doing so. 7 years after the revelation, Michelle had become a successful author. Her book, titled "The Truth Will Surface," combined her personal story with research about deception in relationships and guidance for people navigating the aftermath of betrayal. The book became a bestseller, resonating with people who had experienced various forms of deception and betrayal. Michelle used the platform to advocate for more honest conversations about marriage, about the gap between public appearance and private reality, about the importance of maintaining individual identity within partnership. Michelle's relationship with her children had become one of the greatest sources of joy in her new life. They had initially worried about her, unsure if she would recover from such a comprehensive betrayal, but they watched her not just survive, but thrive. She dated occasionally, but was in no rush to remarry, enjoying her independence and the freedom to make choices based solely on what she wanted rather than what a partner needed. She traveled extensively, often taking her children and eventually her grandchildren on adventures around the world. Robert's journey was slower and more painful. It took him years to fully accept responsibility for his actions without making excuses or trying to rationalize his choices. He worked with a therapist who specialized in helping people who had caused significant harm understand the impact of their actions and make genuine amends where possible. Robert wrote letters to Michelle, not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, but acknowledging the harm he had caused and taking full responsibility for it. Michelle did not respond to most of these letters, but she kept them, and eventually they helped her process her own feelings. The relationship between Robert and his children from his marriage to Michelle slowly, tentatively began to rebuild. Not to where it had been, which was based on a false image of who Robert was, but to something more authentic. His children appreciated that he had stopped making excuses and was genuinely working on himself. They saw him regularly supporting both sets of his children, attempting to be a present father to all of them. They recognized that he would never be who they thought he was, but he might become someone they could eventually respect again. 10 years after that Family Feud episode, Steve Harvey brought both Michelle and Robert back for a special retrospective segment. They appeared separately, not together, each sharing their perspective on what had happened and what they had learned. Michelle spoke about the journey from devastation to empowerment, about learning to trust herself again, about building a life that was authentic and fulfilling. Robert spoke about accountability, about the daily work of becoming someone worthy of his children's respect, about understanding that some consequences last forever and that accepting them was part of genuine change. The segment did not offer a neat, tied-up ending where everyone forgave and reconciled. Instead, it showed the reality of how families navigate major betrayals. Michelle and Robert were cordial when they had to interact around their children and grandchildren, but they were not friends and never would be. Michelle had moved on to a life she loved. Robert was working to be a better father and person, but he carried the weight of his choices every day. Their children had found ways to maintain relationships with both parents while holding appropriate boundaries. The Thompson family story became a cultural touchpoint for discussions about marriage, fidelity, and the consequences of sustained deception. It was referenced in college courses about ethics and relationships. It was discussed in therapy sessions nationwide. It was shared in support groups for people dealing with betrayal. The story's power came from its refusal to offer easy answers or comfortable conclusions. It showed that betrayal had real, lasting consequences, that some damage could not be fully repaired, and that moving forward required accepting difficult truths rather than clinging to comforting lies. Michelle's advocacy work expanded over the years. She started a foundation that provided financial and legal assistance to women going through divorce after long marriages, particularly those who discovered major deceptions. The foundation helped women understand their legal rights, connected them with resources, and provided support groups where they could process their experiences with others who understood. The foundation was funded partially by proceeds from Michelle's book and speaking engagements, but also by donations from people who had been moved by her story. The impact on Sandra and her children was an often overlooked aspect of the story, but the documentary addressed it directly. Sandra had believed she was in a relationship with someone who was committed to her and their children, even if complicated by his obligations to his adult children and his role in a family business, he shared with Michelle. Learning that Robert had presented their relationship completely differently to Michelle, that Sandra and the children had been the secret rather than the priority, had been devastating to her as well. She had to reckon with her own choices and her own denial about the reality of her situation. Sandra eventually spoke publicly about her experience as well, offering a perspective that complicated simple narratives about affairs and other women. She had believed Robert's story about being in the process of divorce, about maintaining appearances for business reasons, about the complications that made their relationship necessarily private. She had trusted him completely, never suspecting that his other family had no idea she existed. Her story served as a reminder that deception victimizes everyone it touches, not just the spouse being openly betrayed. 12 years after the Family Feud episode that never aired but became legendary anyway, the Thompson family story reached its final chapter, at least in the public eye. Michelle published a second book, this one about rebuilding identity and finding purpose after major life disruptions. She had remarried to a fellow teacher who respected her independence and valued her strength. The relationship was different from her marriage to Robert, built on genuine partnership and mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles and assumptions. Robert had also rebuilt aspects of his life, though more modestly. He worked as a project manager for a construction company, having lost his own business. He had consistent relationships with all his children, though they were bounded by appropriate recognition of the harm he had caused. He volunteered extensively with organizations that helped men develop emotional intelligence and relationship skills, using his own failures as teaching moments. He never remarried, focusing instead on being the father he should have been from the beginning to all his children. Steve Harvey reflected on the Thompson family story in his own memoir, published a decade after the incident. He wrote about the moment Robert walked off stage and how it had crystallized something important for him about the responsibility that came with his platform. Television gives us the power to reach millions of people, he wrote. That power comes with an obligation to use it wisely. When Robert walked away and I stopped the cameras, I was choosing human dignity over entertainment value. That choice changed how I approach every episode of Family Feud. I see the people, not just the contestants. I recognize that everyone who stands on that stage is carrying a story, and sometimes that story is heavier than we can imagine. The legacy of that Family Feud moment extended into unexpected areas. Game shows across the industry implemented better protocols for supporting contestants who experienced distress during tapings. Mental health professionals were made available. Producers were trained to recognize signs of genuine crisis versus typical game show nervousness. The industry recognized that while game shows were entertainment, they involved real people with real lives, and those people deserved care and support. For therapists working with couples dealing with infidelity and deception, the Thompson family story became an important teaching tool. It illustrated how public revelation, while initially more painful, often led to more complete accountability than private confession. It showed the long-term work required for genuine healing, whether that healing led to reconciliation or to healthy separation. It demonstrated that there was not one right way to handle betrayal, only the way that was right for each individual situation. Michelle often spoke at conferences and retreats about the unexpected strength that came from facing truth, no matter how painful. She would tell audiences that the worst day of her life, the day her answer on Family Feud exposed Robert's double life, had also been in a strange way the beginning of her best life. Not because she enjoyed the pain or the destruction of her marriage, but because truth, once revealed, had given her the power to make real choices based on reality rather than continuing to live in a comfortable fiction. The question Michelle was asked most frequently was whether she regretted giving that answer on Family Feud, whether she wished she had remained in ignorance. Her response was always consistent. I regret the years I wasted in a marriage that was not real. I regret that I did not trust my instincts sooner. I regret that my answer exposed the truth so publicly in a way that was humiliating and painful. But I do not regret knowing the truth. Ignorance might have felt more comfortable in the short term, but it would have been a prison. The truth, as devastating as it was, set me free. As this remarkable story reaches its conclusion, more than a decade after that Family Feud taping where a husband walked out and a wife's world shattered, the lessons remain powerfully relevant. Michelle Thompson's journey from that moment of public devastation to a life of purpose, independence, and genuine happiness serves as inspiration for anyone facing betrayal or deception. Her refusal to accept less than she deserved, her willingness to face painful truth rather than cling to comfortable lies, and her ability to transform her worst experience into a platform for helping others demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit. Robert Thompson's story serves as a warning about the inevitable consequences of sustained deception and the impossibility of maintaining lies indefinitely. His loss of family, reputation, business, and respect was the direct result of choosing deception over honesty for 7 years. His attempts at redemption, while genuine, could not undo the harm he had caused or restore what he had destroyed. His story reminds us that every choice we make has consequences, and the consequences of choosing lies over truth can be devastating and permanent. Steve Harvey's role in this story illustrates the power of compassion and the importance of recognizing when entertainment must yield to human need. His decision to stop the cameras, to prioritize the Thompson family's dignity over television drama, and to continue supporting Michelle through her journey showed that character and values matter more than ratings. His ongoing reflection on the experience and willingness to learn from it demonstrated the kind of growth that comes from taking seriously the responsibility of having a public platform. The moment when Michelle Thompson gave that innocent answer about the biggest lie spouses tell, not knowing she was describing her own marriage, became a catalyst for truth that could no longer be denied. When Robert walked out mid-game, unable to bear the weight of his deception any longer, he set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to accountability, consequence, and various forms of healing. The story proves that truth has power, that deception eventually collapses under its own weight, and that while the revelation of truth can be devastating, it is always preferable to living in a lie. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about truth, consequences, and the importance of living with integrity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share family feud moments that go beyond entertainment to touch on real human experiences, real struggles, and real lessons. The Thompson family story, painful as it is, reminds us that truth matters, that choices have consequences, and that rebuilding from devastation is possible when we face reality with courage and honesty. Thank you for watching, and remember that your own truth, whatever it may be, deserves to be honored and lived authentically.